Unknown? Habib Tabangi. Superhabib Vs The Shadow. Chapter 1. The Lumina Glow. Lumina was a city that hummed with life, a vibrant tapestry woven from the dreams and aspirations of its inhabitants. Gleaming skyscrapers pierced the clouds, reflecting the perpetual glow that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the metropolis. On the streets below, throngs of people went about their day with confident energy, their laughter and chatter forming a constant symphony in the air. It was a city of innovation, of art, of endless possibilities, and it was all under the watchful eye of its most cherished protector, Superhabib. Known to a select few by his given name Habib, Superhabib was as much a part of Lumina as the river that wound through its center, or the iconic spire that crowned its skyline. His days were a balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary. By dawn, one might find him sitting at a corner cafe, hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, blending in with the morning commuters. He enjoyed these moments of quiet, observing the rhythm of the city he so deeply loved. He knew the faces of shopkeepers opening their stores, the barista who always added an extra swirl of foam to his drink, the crossing guard who greeted each child with a high five. Lumina's pulse was his pulse. Its joy gave him strength, and its sorrows pricked at his senses like static in the air. This connection to the city ran deeper than duty. Superhabib and Lumina shared a symbiotic bond. He had the uncanny ability to sense shifts in the city's mood. When hope and happiness flowed through Lumina, he felt a bright warmth energize him. If ever despair or fear took root, even briefly, a shadow of unease would fall over his own heart, a warning that something was amiss. This sensitivity made him an unparalleled guardian, often detecting trouble before any alarm was raised or any villain struck. Over the years he had learned to trust these instincts. On one particular golden afternoon, as the sun dipped low and bathed the skyline in amber, Superhabib felt a faint tremor in that bond. It was subtle, so subtle that an ordinary person might have dismissed it as a momentary chill or a passing gloomy thought. But to Superhabib, it was unmistakable, a discordant note in Lumina's otherwise harmonious song. He paused mid-sip of his coffee at the outdoor cafe, brown eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the streets. All seemed normal at a glance. Children chased each other in a nearby park, an artist painted a mural on a wall, and a street vendor laughed as he handed a customer a glowing orb-shaped balloon. Yet there it was again, a prickle on the back of his neck, a fleeting dimming of the ambient light that only he seemed to notice. Superhabib set down his cup and stood, smoothing out the front of his casual shirt. To those around he looked like any young man taking a stretch after sitting too long. Inside, however, he was on alert. The faint dissonance he detected felt like a warning whisper from the city itself. It wasn't the blare of a siren or the flash of a news bulletin, but something ancient and quiet. A cloud briefly crossed the sun, casting a shadow over the boulevard. In that momentary shade, he felt it distinctly, a presence, or perhaps the promise of one, something unknown, watching from the periphery of awareness. At that very moment, a sudden commotion on the street snapped his attention fully back to the present. Across the boulevard, a bright red ball bounced away from a small child and rolled into the road. Without hesitation, the little girl chased it, oblivious to the oncoming transit bus, whose driver had just looked down to adjust the radio. Gasps rang out from pedestrians as the bus bore down on the child. In a blur of motion, Superhabib was there. 1 second he stood by the cafe, and the next he was in the middle of the street, scooping the girl into his arms. The bus driver looked up and slammed the brakes, but it was too late to stop completely. Superhabib braced himself and thrust out his free hand. From his palm, a soft golden light burst forth, forming a shimmering barrier. The front of the bus collided with the radiant energy field and slowed to a gentle halt, mere inches from where Superhabib stood holding the trembling child. A collective sigh of relief swept through the onlookers. Superhabib set the girl down gently, patting her shoulders. "Stay safe," he said kindly, smoothing her hair as a frantic parent rushed over to pull the child into an embrace. Before anyone could bombard him with tearful thanks, Superhabib offered a warm smile and leapt lightly back to the sidewalk. The golden barrier dissipated, leaving the bus unharmed and the stunned driver mouthing an apology through the windshield. Within moments, life on the street resumed its pace, albeit with an extra dose of grateful chatter at how disaster had been averted. Yet as Superhabib stepped away from the now gathering crowd, that subtle inner chill returned. Even in this bright, hopeful moment, he felt it. That faint dissonance humming beneath reality. He could save a child from a speeding bus, but could he protect the city from a threat he could barely perceive? The thought lingered as a shadow at the back of his mind. That evening, Superhabib patrolled the city as he often did, though now with heightened vigilance. Dusk fell gently, bringing on the neon glow of Lumina's lights that kept darkness at bay. Yet as he soared silently above the rooftops, he caught glimpses of oddities that set his nerves on edge. In one alleyway, lights flickered without cause, plunging the narrow corridor into momentary darkness before electricity sputtered back. On a normally cheerful plaza, a street performer's flame-twirling act abruptly snuffed out, the performer frowning at his torch as if it had betrayed him. Minor incidents, perhaps mere coincidences, but each left behind an eerie stillness that dissipated only when Superhabib drew closer. By the time night fully cloaked the city, that sense of an unseen menace had grown stronger. Superhabib perched atop the crown of a modern art museum, one of his favorite vantage points, and gazed out over Lumina. The city lights were as brilliant as ever, from the radiant billboards to the soft halo of street lamps lining the avenues. But something felt different tonight. He closed his eyes and concentrated, extending his awareness. It was then he felt the first hint of it in the air, a subtle chill, like a draft from a long-sealed crypt, and with it a ripple of emotion that was not his own, doubt, unease, dread. Superhabib's heart quickened. Danger often announced itself in clear ways, a scream, an explosion, a villain's taunt echoing through the night. This was altogether different, a veiled threat that seeped in like a mist. He had never encountered its like. And yet, he thought, scanning below where late-night revelers wandered between clubs and cafes, perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps he was simply tired or imagining shadows where there were none. But the unease remained. Whatever lurked at the edges of Lumina this night, it was patient and creeping. With a final glance at the lively streets, people still dancing, sharing meals, living without fear, Superhabib knew he would not allow this nameless threat to harm his city. Lumina's glow was more than the sum of its lights. It was the spirit of its people, and he would safeguard it with every ounce of his strength. Straightening his posture, he leapt from the museum roof and soared into the night sky, a streak of gentle light trailing in his wake. As he began his rounds in earnest, a silent prayer formed in his thoughts, that whatever darkness loomed, he could meet it and extinguish it before its shadow fell upon Lumina. Chapter 2. The Whispers of Dread. In the days that followed that uneasy evening, an unsettling pattern emerged. What began as fleeting whispers on street corners and worried murmurs at dinner tables soon turned into concrete reports that no one could ignore. People were disappearing, not in any ordinary way. There were no ransom notes, no signs of struggle or escape, but vanishing as if they had simply slipped out of existence between one moment and the next. The first was a renowned architect, celebrated for his designs that bathed buildings in natural light. He vanished from his locked studio in broad daylight. Colleagues found only his drafting tools scattered on the floor and an inexplicable chill lingering in the air. Then a beloved musician failed to appear for her nightly concert. The stage crew discovered her violin lying on an empty stage, the bow resting across it as if she had set it down only seconds before. The instrument was still warm to the touch, yet its owner was gone. Each new disappearance sent ripples of fear through Lumina. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about friends who went missing on their walk home, or co-workers who never arrived for their morning shift. The police were baffled. Detective Amir, the lead investigator on the missing persons cases, combed through security footage and interviewed witnesses, but found nothing beyond the eerie commonalities. No evidence of break-ins, no screams heard, only a lingering sense of sorrow and a faint odor of ozone at the scenes. It was as if each person had been plucked from reality, leaving behind only emptiness and questions. Superhabib took it upon himself to investigate these strange events in parallel with the authorities. His connection to Lumina attuned him to the aftermath of each disappearance. When he visited the architect's studio, he felt the residual energy claw at him, cold and ancient, so out of place in a room usually filled with creative warmth. At the concert hall, standing on the stage where the musician had last played, he closed his eyes and sensed echoes of emotion, the joy of music abruptly strangled by a shock of fear. These sensations were like nothing he had encountered before. They were dark, heavy vibrations that made his skin crawl and his heart ache. Whatever force was behind this was not a kidnapper or a simple criminal. It was something primal, feeding on fear itself. Late one night, as city clocks chimed midnight, Superhabib found himself drawn to Lumina's oldest district. This quarter was a labyrinth of narrow cobblestone streets and time-worn stone buildings that predated the skyscrapers by centuries. Here gas lamps still glowed alongside modern lights, and murals of past luminaries faded on brick walls. It was also where the latest disappearance had occurred, a young street artist known for painting vibrant, hopeful scenes on those very walls. He had vanished earlier that evening, and the whispers said the colorful mural he had been working on was left half-finished, the paintbrush dropped as if the artist had been startled away. Superhabib glided silently between the old buildings, his senses keen. The further he ventured into the deserted alleyways, the more pronounced that sickly dread became. In a particularly narrow alley where the light from a single flickering lamp barely reached, he felt a sudden wave of fear not his own. It crashed into him, staggering his flight and forcing him to land. His boots touched the uneven cobblestones as he steadied himself against a wall. The air here was frigid, carrying a stench of old rot and something unnatural. His gaze was drawn to the ancient brickwork opposite him, and his blood ran cold. Clinging to the wall were tendrils of pure, inky blackness. They snaked across the bricks like living tar, pulsing as they greedily absorbed every stray beam of light. The alley's meager illumination seemed to bend toward those tendrils and vanish, leaving the corner draped in gloom. Superhabib's eyes narrowed. He had encountered many strange technologies and even a bit of arcane magic in his career, but this felt fundamentally different. This was darkness manifest, not merely the absence of light, but a presence in itself. As he stepped closer, the tendrils reacted. They unwound from the wall and slithered together across the ground, pooling and rising until they formed vaguely humanoid shapes at the alley's dead end. 3 shadowy figures now stood there, each one a silhouette of emptiness against the dim light behind them. They had no features, only outlines of heads, torsos, and limbs, a mockery of human form wrought in darkness. Yet an aura of palpable malevolence emanated from them. The air around Superhabib dropped in temperature, the cold biting through his suit. He instinctively raised a hand, and a faint golden glow began to radiate from his palm, casting quivering light onto the alley walls. The shadow beings hissed at the light, a sound like hot metal plunged into water. They recoiled, their forms flickering as if the simple glow threatened to unravel them. Seeing their reaction, Superhabib pressed his advantage. With a determined frown, he focused the energy in his raised hand. The gentle glow intensified into a concentrated beam of light, which he thrust forward. It lanced through the center of the 3 shapes. There was a sound like glass shattering. For an instant, the alley was illuminated in stark relief. The old graffiti on the walls, the puddles on the ground, the wide-eyed determination on Superhabib's face. Before the darkness imploded, the shadowy figures burst apart into splinters of black mist that evaporated into the night, leaving behind only silence and a lingering bitter smell of burnt ozone. Superhabib kept his hand raised. the golden light still emanating as he scanned for any sign of movement. His breath formed clouds in the sudden chill. The threat in this alley appeared to be gone, but he knew instinctively that what he had fought were not independent creatures. They were extensions, projections of something far greater, like the twitching fingers of a much larger beast testing the air. He took a cautious step forward to where the figures had stood. Nothing remained except for the faint sense of dread still coiling in the atmosphere. It was then that he heard the voice. It did not come from behind him nor from either end of the alley, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. A cold whisper slithered into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. Superhabib's heart pounded as the disembodied voice echoed inside his skull, each word dripping with malice and ancient weary contempt. You cannot fight what you cannot touch, Superhabib. I am the fear in their hearts, the doubt in their minds. I am the shadow, and Lumina will be mine. The declaration reverberated through his very core. It was not loud, but it was laden with a power that felt older than the stones of the city itself. Superhabib grit his teeth, instinctively forming a protective aura of light around his body. He had faced telepaths and trickster spirits before, but nothing quite like this voice that seemed to speak from the darkness between thoughts. His eyes darted around the alley, searching for a target, someone, anyone to confront, but there was only emptiness. Yet he felt a presence, vast and cold, observing him like a predator lurking just out of sight. "Show yourself," Superhabib challenged, his voice firm as it echoed off the narrow walls. Only silence answered, pressing in from all sides. In that silence he could have sworn he heard distant echoes of sobbing, of cruel laughter, of thousands of panicked heartbeats. Then, just as quickly as it had arrived, the presence was gone. The oppressive weight lifted from the alley, leaving Superhabib alone once more under the flickering lamp. It was in that solitude that the true gravity of the situation settled on him. This was a battle unlike any he had fought before. His usual foes had bodies he could subdue or gadgets he could disable. But this adversary was something else entirely, a being of fear and despair that wore darkness as its cloak. It had no face, no form to strike. How could he fight an enemy that lurked in nightmares and shadows? As Superhabib finally left the alley, rising into the sky with the first hint of doubt churning in his gut, a single name echoed in his mind, laden with menace: the Shadow. Chapter 3. The Deepening Gloom. The Shadow's influence spread like a malignant stain across Lumina. The vibrant glow that once defined the city began to dim, replaced by an oppressive, pervasive gloom. Public spaces, once bustling with laughter and life, grew quieter by the day, their inhabitants retreating into the perceived safety of their homes. Fear, once a fleeting emotion, now settled like a heavy blanket over the city, feeding the shadow and making its manifestations bolder and more frequent. What had started as a subtle discord was now a relentless dirge. Reports of unsettling events multiplied. Many came from ordinary citizens. A mother who swore a dark figure loomed in her bedroom doorway at midnight, only to vanish when the lights were turned on. A taxi driver who found his dashboard electronics dead as an unnatural darkness gathered in his back seat for a split second. Entire blocks that experienced simultaneous nightmares. A sudden collective gasp in the night as thousands woke up in cold sweats. These incidents, inexplicable and terrifying, sowed further panic. News channels ran constant coverage of the dark phenomenon, alternating between urging calm and interviewing experts who had no answers. The word on everyone's lips was that Lumina was haunted by something unspeakable. Superhabib scarcely rested at all. Every hour brought new calls for help, and he answered each as swiftly as he could. One afternoon he found himself at a busy downtown plaza where a spontaneous panic had erupted. Shoppers at an open-air market were screaming and scattering in all directions. When Superhabib arrived in a flash of light, the scene he beheld was chaos. Produce stalls overturned, people cowering behind benches or under tables, and at the center a writhing mass of shadow. It pulled out from beneath a vendor's umbrella in a shape like an amorphous octopus. its tendrils lashing out. Each time one passed near a person, that person shrieked and clutched their head, reliving some private terror only they could see. Without hesitation, Superhabib dove into the fray. He landed between a crawling elderly man and an advancing tendril of darkness, planting his feet and thrusting both arms out wide. From his palms surged twin beams of radiant light, carving through the air like golden blades. They slashed through the smoky appendage, slicing it in two. The shadow mass recoiled, parts of it evaporating with that familiar glass shatter hiss. For a moment the darkness retreated toward the base of the umbrella stand, coalescing as if to flee. Superhabib pressed his advantage, stepping forward with a bright aura now enveloping him. The light pouring from his body pushed back the gloom, revealing terrified market-goers blinking in astonishment at the sudden reprieve. The thing under the umbrella flared up in defiance, a last attempt to strike. It formed a spike of pure black and lunged at Superhabib's chest. He grunted as it hit the aura around him, the impact sending ripples through his shield. With a determined cry, he channeled more energy into the protective field. The spike dissolved, unable to penetrate the light. A second later, the entire shadow construct slithered backward, compressing into a tight coil, then shot down a storm drain at the edge of the plaza, vanishing into the darkness below. Superhabib would have given chase, but the sobs of a child nearby pulled him back. There were people here who needed him. He gently helped the elderly man to his feet and extended a calming hand to the others emerging from their hiding places. Children clung to their parents, and adults exchanged shaken glances. Superhabib spoke softly, reassuring them that the danger had passed for now. He could see the questions in their eyes. What was that? Will it come back? How do we stop it? But he had few answers to give. What he could offer was hope, however tenuous. We will get through this, he promised, his voice steady, even as uncertainty gnawed at him from within. Some nodded, drawing a measure of comfort from his confidence, but many faces remained etched with dread. As evening fell, the city that never truly slept tried to go about business as usual under the watch of neon signs and streetlights. But the usual Friday night buzz was absent. Restaurants sat nearly empty. The usual live music that would spill from open-door pubs was silent. Fear was driving people into isolation, and isolation was feeding the shadow. From above, Superhabib watched patrol cars cruise near vacant streets. He had been in contact with Detective Amir repeatedly. The police were now receiving hundreds of distress calls, many incoherent accounts of living shadows and panic attacks. The detective had stopped sounding skeptical and started asking Superhabib for any insight at all into what they were dealing with. In truth, neither the hero nor the authorities had a full understanding yet. They only knew Lumina was under siege by something invisible and terrifying. Superhabib's next call took him to the roof of an apartment building where a crowd had gathered in alarm. When he arrived, he found an athletic young man in jogging clothes perched on the ledge, eyes wide with terror, muttering that they were after him. Neighbors whispered that he was a kind soul who volunteered at a shelter, now seemingly driven mad by fear. Indeed, as Superhabib carefully approached, hands open in a non-threatening gesture, the man shrieked and flinched as if monstrous phantoms encircled him. He swayed on the ledge, 7 stories of empty air yawning behind him. Any sudden move could send him plummeting. "I see them! They're everywhere!" the man gasped, tears streaming down his face. His eyes were unfocused, fixed on horrors only he could see. Superhabib realized the shadow had ensnared this poor soul in an illusion of his worst nightmares. "You're safe," Superhabib said gently, stepping closer inch by inch. With a thought, he allowed a soft glow to emanate from his body, not a blinding light that might startle, but a warm, steady radiance like a calm dawn. The golden light washed over the rooftop, and gradually the man's ragged breathing slowed. His eyes blinked, some clarity returning as the phantoms receded. Taking the moment, Superhabib darted forward with superhuman speed and wrapped an arm securely around the man's waist. They floated down from the ledge to the roof proper, where anxious neighbors reached out to steady the shaken man. He broke down sobbing, the adrenaline and residual fear overwhelming him. Superhabib stayed a moment longer, offering quiet words of comfort before lifting off again into the night. He departed to the sound of murmured thanks and a single question from an old lady in a nightgown. How bad will it get? He had no answer for her. Every victory felt more hollow as the night dragged on. For every person he rescued, two more incidents seemed to erupt elsewhere. He extinguished creeping shadows in one district only to hear of a surge of nightmares in another. His abilities, fueled by Lumina's collective optimism, were being strained. He could feel it. The well of hope he usually drew upon felt as though it were steadily running dry, tainted by the pervasive despair. By the time the clock neared midnight, Superhabib's limbs felt heavy, and his light powers took longer to answer his call. He had never felt so exhausted, not just physically, but deep in his soul. Eventually, Superhabib found himself standing atop the tallest skyscraper in the heart of downtown, the very building where he often went to clear his head. Tonight, even this sanctuary felt encroached upon by the shadow's influence. He looked out over the city, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Lumina had always glittered with a million lights at night, like earthbound stars symbolizing the hopes of all who lived there. But now, vast swathes of the city were dark. In block after block, windows were shuttered and dim. The streets below were sparsely lit, headlights and street lamps swallowed in an unusual haze. From his high vantage, he imagined he could see the darkness swirling in the very air, like a living thing blanketing its prey. For the first time since donning the mantle of protector, Superhabib felt a knot of despair tighten in his chest. He had always believed that no matter how dire the threat, hope would prevail in Lumina, because he could ignite it when needed. But tonight, confronted by this creeping doom that multiplied the more fear it spread, he wondered if even he was enough. His enemies in the past had been tangible, defeatable with strength or cunning. The shadow was different. It was everywhere and nowhere, a foe that turned the city's own fear against itself, and in doing so, it turned his greatest strength, the people's hope, into a weakness. Superhabib hung his head, the wind tugging gently at his cape as he stood at the precipice of the tower. Down below, a siren wailed faintly and then died, and for a long moment there was silence. In that void of sound, doubt rushed in. He had saved countless lives in his time, but could he save the soul of a city? What if each effort only delayed the inevitable? What if this darkness truly could consume Lumina? Alone on that rooftop, bathed in the faint glow of his own ebbing light, Superhabib felt very small against the enormity of the threat. The stars above were obscured by haze, and even the moon's gentle light was muted. He closed his eyes, searching for the usual comforting thrum of Lumina's spirit that he so often felt coursing through him. It was fainter than ever, like a radio signal at the edge of reception. The city was losing hope, and so was he. Chapter 4. A Guiding Light. Even the brightest star can be obscured by a cloud, Superhabib, but its light never truly fades. The unexpected voice was gentle, yet carried clearly over the rooftop. Startled, Superhabib spun around. Standing a few paces behind him on the moonlit rooftop was an elderly woman. She was diminutive in stature, wrapped in a shawl that fluttered in the night breeze, and her face was a map of kindly wrinkles. Yet her eyes gleamed with an inner light that defied the surrounding darkness. Superhabib recognized her immediately. Ilara, Lumina's most revered historian and philosopher. She was something of a living legend herself, a woman who had devoted her life to preserving the city's lore and wisdom. Though he had met her only a handful of times at public events, her calm presence was unmistakable. "Ilara," Superhabib whispered, relief and curiosity mingling in his voice. He hadn't expected anyone else up here, least of all this wise figure from the city's cultural heart. He quickly glanced around to ensure no stray shadows lurked nearby. Satisfied they were alone, he bowed his head in a gesture of respect. I'm sorry I didn't hear you come up." Ilara offered a gentle smile. The winds carry little old me quieter than they used to, she said with a soft chuckle. She stepped forward, her cane tapping lightly on the concrete, and stood beside him at the edge of the roof. Together they gazed out over the slumbering city. For a moment neither spoke. Finally, Superhabib broke the silence, his voice raw with the vulnerability he had allowed few to witness. "It's unlike anything I've ever faced, Alara," he admitted, his shoulders sagging. "How do you fight something made of fear itself? It has no body, no face, nothing I can hit or contain." His words carried the frustration and desperation of the past days. He realized he was close to pleading, "It's turning my own city against itself. I don't know how to stop it." Ilara reached out and placed a warm, steady hand on his arm. Despite her age, her grip was surprisingly reassuring. "You do not fight the darkness with more darkness, dear one," she said softly. "You fight it with light." When Superhabib looked at her, brows furrowed in question, she tapped a finger lightly against his chest, over his heart. "Not just the light you wield in your hands," Alara continued, "but the light within the hearts of the people." She turned her gaze outwards. "The shadow thrives on despair, yes, but it withers in the face of hope. It is a parasite, and like all parasites, it has a host. Lumina is its host right now, and its strength comes from the city's fear. To defeat it, you must sever that connection." Superhabib took in her words, a frown of concentration on his face. He had sensed something like that, how the shadow grew bolder as more people succumbed to panic. But hearing it confirmed aloud was bracing. "Sever the connection. You mean stop the fear, but that's..." He gestured to the dark cityscape. "That's all anyone feels anymore." Alara's eyes crinkled kindly. "Not all, Superhabib. Not yet. There is fear, yes, but there is also the capacity for courage. The shadow wants the people to forget their own strength. You must help them remember it." She settled onto a nearby rooftop maintenance box as a makeshift seat, inviting him to sit as well. Superhabib remained standing, too restless to relax, but he listened intently as Alara began to speak in low, measured tones, as though recounting a story by a hearth. "Lumina has seen darkness before," she said, waving a hand at the city. "Long before you were born, before I was born, in the earliest days of this place. The records are scarce, more legend than fact, but as a girl, I remember my grandmother telling me of an ancient darkness that once loomed over our ancestors." Superhabib found himself hanging on her every word. The city's modern history was well known to him, but ancient legends were Ilara's domain. "What did your grandmother say?" he prompted gently. Ilara's gaze drifted upward as if peering through time. "She spoke of a time when the settlement that stood where Lumina is now was nearly consumed by despair. They said an unspeakable terror stalked the night, feeding on the fear of villagers. People lost trust in one another, locking themselves away. A shadow fell across the land for years, but it was eventually driven back." She looked at him and smiled. "Not by a warrior's blade, nor by some spell, but by the collective will of the people. They found hope in each other. They built great bonfires and gathered together every night, sharing stories and songs to keep the darkness at bay. One day, the darkness simply broke, like a storm that had spent its fury. In the ashes of that terror, those people founded what would become Lumina, vowing that their city would forever be a beacon of light." Superhabib felt a glimmer of something warm in his chest as he listened, hope stirring anew. "So you believe this shadow is the same darkness from legend?" Alara pursed her lips thoughtfully. "In a manner of speaking, perhaps not the exact same entity, but born of the same source, the fears of people. Over time, fear can take on a life of its own, especially when fed by many minds. The shadow is a collective consciousness, forged from forgotten nightmares of a bygone era. It slept for centuries, dormant because the world changed. New hopes outshone old fears. But now, in our era of anxieties and uncertainties, it has reawakened, gathering strength from every doubt, every despairing thought that goes unchecked." Superhabib thought of the missing people, of the nightmares and the living shadows he'd fought. It's not magic or science, he murmured, echoing her implications. It's emotion. Ilara nodded. Pure emotion. Fear given form. That is why your usual methods have only limited effect. You've been trying to punch and blast at something that is essentially a reflection of the city's collective dread. To truly hurt it, you must address the source of its power. He dragged a hand through his hair, that familiar determination beginning to kindle again within him. The people, I have to help them not be afraid. It sounded almost impossible. How could one person hope to calm an entire city in the grip of terror? But Ilara's presence made it seem just plausible enough to try. Ilara smiled approvingly. You can inspire them. That is your gift as much as any light you shoot from your hands. Have you not noticed? Your true power is not just in what you can do, but how you make them feel. Superhabib, you are a symbol. As much as the shadow is a symbol of despair, you are one of hope. The people of Lumina believe in you. They draw strength from your courage. That is why the shadow sought you out with those whispers. It knows that if you lose hope, so will the city. Her words rang true. Superhabib recalled the marketplace earlier, how simply standing his ground with confidence had helped bring people back from the brink of panic. He remembered the rooftop with the terrified man, how the gentle light and calm voice had been enough to pull him from the ledge. He had been doing more than fighting shadows. He had been trying to reassure and inspire all along. He just hadn't realized that was the key. A spark rekindled in Superhabib's eyes. The weight on his shoulders lightened a fraction. So I rally them, remind them who they are, who we are as a city, he said, a plan taking shape in his mind. If fear was the shadow's weapon, then hope would be his. Precisely, Ilara said, standing once more with some effort. Superhabib offered his arm to steady her. She patted his hand gratefully and continued, Your battle must be fought on two fronts. Yes, defend people from the immediate dangers, but more importantly, ignite the light within them. If you do that, the shadow will have nothing to feed on. He drew a deep breath, feeling his confidence flow back. Still, a question nagged at him. Ilara, earlier you said I must sever the connection between the shadow and Lumina. Is inspiring hope enough to do that? Ilara glanced toward the center of the city where the Lumina spire, the tallest structure, stood. Its silhouette was dark tonight, the usual brilliant beacon at its peak, extinguished by emergency citywide power conservation. Hope is the beginning, she replied, but there may be more to it. The shadow has sunk its claws deep. In our history, symbols mattered, just as the bonfires once symbolized communal hope. The Lumina Spire, for instance, was designed to be a symbol of unity and light. It concentrates and reflects the city's energy. If the shadow corrupts something like that, she trailed off, letting the implication hang. Superhabib felt a chill despite himself. The spire, usually glowing as a lighthouse of hope across the city, had gone dark this week in the crisis. If the shadow managed to turn it into a focal point of fear, the damage could be catastrophic. He nodded firmly. I'll keep watch over it, and over everything. Ilara took his hand in both of hers, her grip papery but determined. You are not alone, Superhabib. Remember that. I will do what I can as well. Search the archives for any forgotten lore. Speak to the city leaders about supporting the people's morale. This fight is yours, but all of Lumina must fight it with you in spirit. Moved by her conviction, Superhabib bowed his head. Thank you, Ilara. I won't forget what you've taught me tonight. He felt the urge to hug the kindly old woman, and after a moment's hesitation, did so gently. She returned the embrace warmly. Above them the nocturnal clouds began to part, a rare sight in the past days. Through the break a few stars glimmered, and the pale light of the waning moon shone down. Ilara looked up and smiled. Dawn will be here in a few hours, she said. A new day. Superhabib followed her gaze upward, watching the stars. The night was still long, and much would need to be done come morning. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt the tightness in his chest ease. There was a way forward, a path lit by hope. The shadow was powerful, yes, but it was not unbeatable. Not if they could remind everyone, himself included, of the light that still lived within them. As he escorted Alara safely back inside and then prepared to set off into what remained of the night, Superhabib's mind was already working on a plan. He would rally the city. Lumina would not face this darkness cowering in fear and isolation. They would face it united, their hearts burning bright, and with that collective light guiding him, Superhabib felt sure that the shadow could be driven back into the nothingness from whence it came. Chapter 5. Gathering Light. True to his resolve, Superhabib wasted no time. With the first glow of dawn, he set out across Lumina, not to hunt shadows, but to kindle hope. He began in the neighborhoods hardest hit by the prior nights of terror, blocks where lights had gone out and stayed out, where people huddled behind locked doors. These places, which had fallen silent and fearful, were the very heart of the shadow's feeding ground. In a small cul-de-sac on the west side, morning light found Superhabib knocking on doors, not as a hero swooping in from above, but as a humble neighbor checking in. One by one, cautious faces peered out. He spoke gently to each person he met, asking if they were all right, listening to their worries, offering words of reassurance. An elderly man confessed he hadn't slept for fear the shadows would come for him. Superhabib helped him replace a busted porch light and sat with him a while, sharing a story of a time he himself had felt afraid and overcome it. A single mother admitted she'd kept her children home from school out of terror. Superhabib arranged with local volunteers to escort groups of kids together, turning the walk to school into a show of community solidarity rather than a lonely venture. Small gestures, but in each interaction he fanned a spark of courage. Word spread quickly that Superhabib was out in the daylight, not battling monsters in the sky, but walking the streets with a reassuring smile. Wherever he went, people emerged tentatively from their homes to talk, to seek comfort, or even just to see their hero in person, alive and unafraid in the light of day. Some of the local news crews caught on and began trailing him. By afternoon, footage aired citywide of Superhabib shaking hands with shop owners, helping children paint a bright mural over a vandalized wall, covering grim graffiti that read "Embrace the Shadow" with vibrant flowers and suns, and organizing impromptu street corner gatherings where neighbors shared uplifting anecdotes of kindness amid crisis. Meanwhile, Detective Amir and other civic leaders were doing their part. At Superhabib's urging, the city's emergency broadcast system, which had thus far only blared warnings and curfews, started sharing messages of solidarity and encouragement. On the radio, a calm voice reminded listeners to check on each other and to remember they were not alone. Places of worship opened their doors to all, offering shelter and counsel, regardless of faith. Community centers put out hot tea and blankets, inviting people to gather in light and fellowship during the evenings instead of cowering in isolation. Lumina's people, long proud of their vibrant community, slowly began to rediscover their backbone. Fear still lurked, but it was no longer unchallenged. By that evening, Superhabib and Ilara, who had been busy rallying intellectuals and artists to contribute their talents to the cause, helped organize a city-wide event, the Gathering of Light. At the Central Plaza in downtown, just under the dark silhouette of the Lumina spire, hundreds of citizens came together. They carried candles, lanterns, and even the neon glow sticks usually reserved for festivals. Children held up handmade paper lamps painted with cheerful faces. Despite the tension in the air, there was a current of excitement. People were tired of being afraid and eager to stand together. Superhabib stood upon a makeshift stage, a flatbed truck decorated with strings of LED lights, overlooking the assembled crowd. Beside him were a few familiar faces. Detective Amir in his rolled-up shirt sleeves, looking out with a watchful yet hopeful gaze, a popular radio host who had been a comforting voice over the airwaves, a young nurse who had organized hospital staff to bring patients out for a breath of fresh evening air. Ilara was there too, seated in the front row with a candle in hand. her wise face illuminated in gentle glow. This gathering was as much her doing as his. Superhabib raised a hand and the murmurs of the crowd quieted. He took a moment to sweep his gaze across the plaza. He saw faces drawn with fatigue and lingering fear, but also eyes lit with a glint of anticipation. In the surrounding buildings, more people watched from balconies and rooftops, clutching candles like tiny stars in the gloom. He spoke, voice amplified by nothing more than natural acoustics and the respectful silence of those listening. "People of Lumina," he began, "for days now we have been living through a nightmare. We've been haunted by something we don't fully understand. We've felt afraid." He paused, taking in his own admission. "I have felt afraid, but tonight, standing here with all of you, I don't feel fear. I feel hope." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some smiled, others wiped away stray tears. Superhabib continued, his words gaining strength. "Lumina has always been a city of light, not just because of our lights and technology, but because of our spirit. Look around you." He gestured, and the people did, seeing neighbors and strangers shoulder to shoulder. "We are not alone. The shadow wants us isolated and terrified. It wants us to believe that our fear is stronger than our hope. But it's wrong. We carry the light of hope inside us, each and every one. And when we stand together, that light shines brighter than any darkness." As if on cue, one of the community volunteers signaled, and the plaza's sound system, running on portable generators, struck up music. A trio of musicians, one of them the very violinist who had vanished and miraculously reappeared earlier that day, found dazed but alive after the shadow's retreat, took the stage beside Superhabib. The violinist tucked her instrument under her chin and began to play a melody that was familiar to all in Lumina, the city's unofficial anthem, a song of hope that children learned in school. The crowd's hush transformed into soft singing as voices joined the melody. One by one, like a wave, hundreds of voices lifted the song into the night. Candles were raised, their collective glow pushing back the darkness overhead. Superhabib's heart swelled at the sound. He didn't notice at first, but the emblem on his chest, the sunburst symbol of Lumina, began to emit a faint light of its own, resonating with the positivity around him. He added his voice to the song, not loudly but earnestly, as he stood among his people rather than above them. But the shadow was not gone. Unseen by the celebrants, wisps of black had been gathering at the edges of the plaza, pooling in alleyways and under parked cars. Drawn by the congregation of hope, or perhaps threatened by it, the darkness coiled like a snake preparing to strike. As the song reached its second verse, a verse about overcoming hardship, a shudder passed through the ground. A few voices faltered, and the nurse on stage frowned, looking around. Superhabib sensed it a split second before it happened. He thrust a hand up, conjuring a globe of light around the stage, just as a pillar of darkness erupted from a manhole in the center of the plaza. People screamed and stumbled back as the pillar of darkness twisted and fanned out into a monstrous form, a towering apparition shaped vaguely like a hulking beast with claws. Its body was the night sky torn free of stars, and its eyes, if it had any, were voids within voids. The shadow had sent a manifestation more powerful than any before, perhaps even expending a significant part of itself to do so. It was a direct challenge to the hope gathering here. For a heartbeat fear threatened to resurge among the crowd. The song died out as the last note of the violin quavered into silence. The darkness beast opened a maw and emitted a shriek that sounded like metal tearing and a chorus of anguished cries all at once. Several people in the front clapped hands over their ears, faces contorting in terror. But then a new sound cut through the din, a single voice singing the next line of the anthem, steady and strong. It was Elara. She had risen to her feet, candle held aloft, singing into the very face of darkness. Her voice, though old, did not waver. Inspired by her courage, others joined. The radio host next to Superhabib picked up the lyric, followed by Detective Amir in his deep baritone, then dozens more, then hundreds. The song rose again, defiantly, even as the monstrous shadow entity howled. Superhabib felt the warmth of that collective courage flood into him. With a shout, he launched himself off the truck and into the air above the plaza. He streaked toward the dark beast, which swiped at him with a colossal, shadowy claw. He dodged in midair, light streaming from his limbs. "You're not welcome here," he yelled, and the crowd below roared in agreement, a chorus of voices yelling out in support or singing at the top of their lungs. Bolstered by their hope, Superhabib slammed into the creature, both fists forward like a glowing comet. There was a blinding flash as his body impacted the darkness. The shadow beast recoiled, actually stumbling back against the force. Where Superhabib's aura met the creature's form, the dark matter sizzled and evaporated. It swung again, a flurry of black tendrils whipping toward him and the crowd beyond, but Superhabib flew in a tight arc, intercepting each tendril with a slicing beam of light from his hands. Below, the citizens held their ground, continuing to sing, shout, and shine their lights. Some had formed protective huddles around the most vulnerable, shielding them. Realizing brute force alone might not finish the entity, Superhabib chose a different approach. He hovered just out of the creature's reach, closed his eyes, and concentrated, drawing on every flicker of hope and love and bravery emanating from the people beneath. He focused that energy into a radiant pulse. When he opened his eyes, they glowed white gold. With a mighty cry, he unleashed a wave of illumination that cascaded outward like the sun's own flare. The wave hit the shadow beast, and the monster froze. Its claw, raised to strike, disintegrated into motes of black. Its screeching maw was silenced mid-cry, the darkness shredded by the light. In seconds, the towering figure of gloom was unraveling, fraying into strands of shadow that drifted upward and dissipated into nothing. A final guttural hiss escaped it, and then it was gone, scattered by the collective brightness of a unified lumina. In the aftermath, silence reigned for a brief moment. Superhabib landed back atop the truck, breathing hard but triumphant. The crowd stared in astonishment at the empty space where pure evil had stood moments before. Then someone started clapping, and another joined, and soon applause and cheers swept through the plaza. Laughter mingled with relieved sobbing as people embraced each other. The violinist plucked a string experimentally and, finding it intact, resumed the anthem where she left off. This time the notes soared victoriously, barely audible over the joyous cacophony of an emboldened city. Superhabib allowed himself a smile as he scanned the plaza. He saw Ilara lower her candle, eyes shining with pride. Detective Amir was on his cell phone already, excitedly telling his officers what had happened. Strangers and friends sang arm in arm. It was working. He had lit a spark, and now the city was catching flame in the best possible way. Yet he also knew this victory, while significant, was not the end. The shadow itself was still out there, perhaps weakened, but undoubtedly furious. Tonight, however, the people of Lumina had tasted hope again. They had stood up to the darkness and watched it flee. That experience, he trusted, would not be easily forgotten. As the gathering gradually turned into a community celebration under the night sky, Superhabib silently thanked Ilara's wisdom. Hope was indeed the greatest weapon, and now it burned anew in every heart present. Chapter 6, Nightfall. For a brief respite after the gathering of light, Lumina dared to hope that the worst was behind them. The next morning dawned brighter than any in recent memory, with golden sunlight spilling over balconies and through the streets. The city felt rejuvenated, neighbors greeted each other with relieved smiles, and the news channels reported on the previous night's victory as if the siege of darkness might finally be lifting. Superhabib continued making rounds, finding that many citizens were determined not to slip back into despair. Where once people barred their doors, now they left them ajar to talk in hallways. Where fear had kept shutters closed, now windows were thrown open to let in light and the sound of life outside. It was a fragile optimism, but it was growing. Yet even in this newfound daylight optimism, there were signs that the shadow had not conceded. In the early afternoon, Detective Amir met with Superhabib in a quiet corner of the Central Police Precinct. The detective's normally steady gaze was troubled as he spread photographs on his desk. They showed graffiti and symbols that had been found scrawled overnight on city walls, crude black shapes of eyes and fanged smiles, and phrases like, "Fear the light," and "He is coming." Amir explained in a low voice that a few arrests had been made after curfew, people caught painting these messages. They weren't ordinary vandals. Some were known as upstanding citizens until days ago. Under questioning, they spoke of visions, of a truth revealed to them in nightmares. One man, shaking with zeal, had proclaimed that the shadow was not to be resisted but worshipped, that it would remake the world free of the deception of hope. Superhabib frowned at the images and the report. It was a bitter reminder that the shadow's corruption could take root in human minds, turning the very people he was trying to save into unwitting agents of chaos. "A cult!" he muttered half in disbelief. Amir nodded grimly. "If you can call a handful of deluded souls a cult, we think they've been connecting online, spreading panic and nihilism in equal measure." Another officer joined them, a tech specialist who revealed transcripts from message boards filled with doomsaying, conspiracies that the city's water was poisoned with fear or that giving in to the shadow was the only way to survive its wrath. Superhabib's jaw tightened. Lies and despair, propagating like a virus. The shadow was fighting back in subtler ways, preying on the vulnerable minds it had unhinged. They agreed on a plan. The police would quietly counteract the cult's messaging, flooding the networks with truthful, calming information and tracking down key agitators for intervention. Superhabib, for his part, would remain vigilant. If the shadow sought to attack through human pawns, he would need to be as ready to save people from themselves as from monsters. Towards dusk, as Superhabib left the precinct, a strange stillness fell over the city. The weather had been clear and warm all day, but now an abrupt chill swept in. Above, dark clouds gathered with unnatural speed, heavy and unresponsive to the last orange rays of sunset. It was as if someone had drawn a shade over the sky. The streetlights flickered on early, their sensors fooled by the dimming light, but even those lamps seemed feeble and distant. By nightfall, Lumina was eerily dark again. Not a star could be seen above, and the moon was hidden behind a black mass of clouds that towered unnaturally high, a swirling tempest without a drop of rain. Superhabib's earpiece crackled. Emergency communications from across the city began to pour in. Electricity grids were fluctuating. Whole districts reported power outages. It was as if the darkness itself was leaching energy from the city. Suddenly, an urgent call came through from the main hospital downtown. The terrified voice of a nurse shouted over a cacophony of noise. "We need help! The backup generators failed! And something is in the building! People are panicking in the dark!" Superhabib didn't need to hear more. He shot into the air, a comet of light streaking toward City General Hospital, which loomed ahead as a hulking silhouette against the black sky. As he neared the hospital, he saw confusion spilling into the streets. Several ambulances sat inert, their lights off. Apparently even vehicle electronics had been affected. Dozens of patients and staff were evacuating the front entrance, many with IV lines still attached or in wheelchairs, guided by phone flashlights and whatever illumination they could find. Above them, on the higher floors behind glass, winks of small lights, maybe people using cell phones, dotted the otherwise pitch-black windows. Superhabib realized with dread that many patients would be too critical to move. They were likely still inside, trapped in darkness. He landed amidst the crowd at the entrance, immediately emanating a bright glow to light up the immediate area. "Superhabib!" a doctor gasped, relief and worry intermingling on her face. "It's chaos in there. None of the equipment is working and some thing is stalking the halls. We've got most out of the ER and lobby, but the ICU and pediatric ward are on the 7th floor and the elevators." She trailed off, but he understood. No power for elevators and too many fragile patients to carry down easily, especially with a threat inside. "I'll handle it," he assured her. "Keep everyone out here safe. With that, he rushed through the entrance and into the Stygian depths of the hospital. His aura radiated ahead of him in a bubble, casting long shadows down corridors lined with gurneys and frightened staff tending to those who couldn't be moved. Cries and moans echoed through the stairwells as he ascended, the wail of an infant, the panicked pleas of a man begging unseen pursuers for mercy. Each floor he passed was a scene of barely contained fear. On the 7th floor landing, Superhabib encountered pure pandemonium. The hallway lights flickered weakly, and in their intermittent glow he glimpsed shapes slithering along the walls, tendrils of darkness slipping in and out of patient rooms. 2 nurses stood guard at a doorway, holding a battery lantern. Their faces were pale, but determined as they tried to reassure the voices within. A monstrous, spidery silhouette skittered across the ceiling towards them. Superhabib reacted instantly, sending a spear of light through the apparition. It burst in a spray of shadow, and the nurses jumped. One let out a breath of relief seeing him. The other swallowed hard and pointed down the opposite wing. The children's ward. Something went in there, she whispered, fear for those kids etched in her eyes. Superhabib nodded once and flew down the corridor. He could feel it. A dense note of despair, like a black hole sucking in hope, emanating from the pediatric unit. He rounded the corner to the ward and saw a sight that froze his blood. A colossal shadow form, vaguely humanoid but with impossibly long arms, loomed at the far end of the room. In its grip, levitated by invisible force, was a hospital bed surrounded by a translucent bubble of darkness. Inside that bubble, a child lay whimpering, her body haloed by the machines that were supposed to keep her alive, machines now dark and silent. Several other children in their beds cried out in terror or pain as the air pressure in the room seemed to drop. 2 parents who had been keeping vigil stood helplessly by, one banging on an unyielding wall of shadow that separated them from their child. The long-armed figure turned what might have been a head towards Superhabib and issued a low growl as if warning him not to interfere. But interfere he did, without hesitation. Superhabib hurled himself forward, smashing against the barrier holding the suspended bed. His energy flared, golden light pushing back against oily darkness. The creature hissed. It flung out one of its arms, and the shadows around the other bed surged, coalescing into grasping hands that clutched at the remaining children and their frantic parents. Heart hammering, Superhabib pushed harder, pouring every ounce of will into his light. He carved an opening in the bubble and reached through to grab the little girl's bed. Her wide, tear-filled eyes met his for a split second. "It's okay," he told her softly, though his voice strained with effort. With a mighty tug, he pulled the bed out of the floating prison. The moment the child was clear, he shouted to the parents, "Take her! Go!" They rushed to wheel her out as the bubble of darkness snapped shut where she had been, now empty. The shadow entity reared in fury, all arms and malice, and lunged at Superhabib. He met it head on. The ward lit up with strobe-like flashes as they exchanged blows, tendrils of darkness smashing against shields of light. Superhabib fought with everything in him, mindful that behind him the remaining families were cowering under beds or in corners. Every time a piece of the creature's form flaked off under his assault, it seemed to draw new strength from the ambient fear in the room, regenerating. This was a smaller fragment of the shadow's essence, but still potent in an environment rife with dread. Realizing brute force might not suffice, while terror reigned, Superhabib changed tactics. He cast a glance over his shoulder at the trembling figures. "Sing!" he yelled, voice commanding but compassionate. "All of you, think of something good and hold on to it. Sing, pray, just don't give in to fear." His words were jarring in context, but a desperate mother understood. Cradling her child, she began to sing a lullaby, her voice quavering but steady on the melody. A father clenched his jaw and joined with a whispered children's song through his tears. A nurse still in the room added her voice, calling out encouragement to her patients by name, telling them to remember the sunshine and their favorite playgrounds. As faint music and murmured affirmations filled the ward, the balance shifted. Superhabib felt the darkness creature falter just slightly, its form flickering. Seizing the moment, He summoned a concentrated sphere of light between his hands and thrust it into the creature's center. The sphere detonated in a soundless flash. The shadow form bellowed in agony, a sound that reverberated not in the ears but in the mind. Then it blew apart into tatters of black that evaporated into the corners of the room, leaving only the echo of sobs and singing. Panting, Superhabib quickly helped stabilize the ward. Doctors and more nurses, guided by his light, arrived to take over caring for the children and finish the evacuation down the stairs. He watched as parents scooped up the young patients or rolled beds out, their fear subsiding into determination to get their loved ones to safety. The crisis here was abating, and by the time he escorted the last group down to the lobby, city power was even flickering back in the block. The emergency crews had rerouted electricity. The hospital was battered, but most had escaped with their lives thanks to the quick evacuation and his intervention. Outside, applause broke out as Superhabib emerged with the final patients. He offered a brief wave, but his mind was already racing to the next emergency, because this blackout had not been limited to the hospital. His communicator buzzed with multiple alerts, localized panics, sightings of shadowy forms in various districts. The shadow was retaliating across the board. One alert made his breath catch. Trouble at the Grand Archive, Lumina's central library and museum, Ilara's workplace and second home. Staff reported dark figures breaking into the sealed rare collections vault. Ilara had been there late, poring over ancient texts for anything to help their cause. Superhabib launched himself skyward, dread coiling in his stomach. The archive was across town. He pushed himself to fly faster, the wind howling in his ears. As he neared the historic building, a grand marble structure normally lit by ornate lanterns, he saw that now it stood dark, one corner of its facade charred and smoking, as if an explosion had blown out a wall. He streaked through a shattered window into the main reading hall. The scene inside made his heart plummet. Books and scrolls lay scattered and trampled. Display cases were shattered. Here and there small fires smoldered, likely from burst gas lamps. He quickly doused them with blasts of energy before they could spread. Then he saw a silhouette amidst the rubble, one of Ilara's colleagues, an archivist, slumped against an overturned table. Superhabib rushed over and found the man dazed but alive. "Ilara!" The man coughed, blood on his lips. "They took her. Those shadows took her." Superhabib felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. "Where?" he pressed urgently. "Did you see where they went?" The archivist winced, clutching his arm. "Down. They dragged her down, through the basement, into the old catacombs." His eyes were unfocused with shock and pain. Superhabib gently eased the man back. The catacombs, Lumina's foundation, was crisscrossed with old tunnels and chambers from centuries past. Ilara had mentioned them in passing, but said they'd been sealed for ages. A cold realization hit him. The shadow had a plan. While he was busy saving others in one place, it had struck at another, targeting the very person who had reignited his hope and the city's. Ilara, the guiding light of Lumina's history and heart, was now in its clutches. Anguish and guilt crashed over Superhabib. He had made a choice, the many over the one, and while he would not undo saving those children for anything, the cost was devastating. In that moment, despair beckoned to him once more. It whispered that he had failed her, that racing off to fight one fire had allowed another to consume something precious. He swayed on his feet, the weight of fatigue and sorrow nearly buckling his knees. But then the archivist weakly grabbed his wrist. "Please save her," the man breathed. In his eyes, despite pain, there was trust, faith that if anyone could bring Ilara back, it was Lumina's hero. Superhabib steeled himself. He gently squeezed the man's shoulder. "I will," he promised, voice low but firm. With renewed resolve, he stood and gazed towards a gaping hole in the floor, an entrance ripped open to the ancient underbelly of the city. A foul, cold air wafted up from it, as if the darkness below exhaled. He knew where he had to go. Summoning a sphere of light to hover at his shoulder and light the way, Superhabib descended into the breach, alone and determined. Night had truly fallen over Lumina again, but he carried the hopes of the city with him into the depths. The shadow wanted to snuff out every guiding light, but as long as he had breath, Superhabib would not let Alara's light, or Lumina's, go out without a fight. Chapter 7. Beneath the City. The descent into the catacombs was like entering the maw of an ancient beast. Superhabib stepped carefully down a winding stone staircase, slick with moisture and age. The air was dank and cold. Each breath tasted of mildew and centuries-old dust. His orb of light floated at his shoulder, illuminating carvings on the walls, old symbols of sunburst and eyes that watched from the stone, remnants of a bygone era. He wondered if those who built these tunnels had faced a similar terror, leaving behind warnings or wards against the darkness. At the foot of the stairs, the space opened into a tunnel with a vaulted ceiling. Columns of carved rock held up the weight of the city above. Some were cracked, crumbled, leaving piles of rubble that narrowed the path. Superhabib moved forward, senses straining for any sign of Alara or the shadowy kidnappers. Distantly, a drip of water echoed. Somewhere else, a faint scuttling hinted at rats or worse. He pressed on, one hand outstretched to cast his light further down the tunnel. After walking for minutes that felt like hours, he came upon a fork. As he paused, unsure which route to take, a beam of flashlight suddenly danced on the far wall behind him. He whirled around, ready for danger. "Easy, it's me," came a whisper. Detective Amir emerged from the stairwell's gloom, pistol in one hand, heavy-duty torch in the other. Behind him were two other figures, a young police officer with sweat on his brow and an older woman from the archives staff clutching a satchel of what looked like maps. Superhabib recognized the woman, Marion, Ilara's assistant, her face pale but resolute. "We heard what happened," Amir said quietly, stepping up. "You didn't think we'd let you do this alone, did you?" There was a mixture of concern and determination in his eyes. Superhabib felt a surge of gratitude. These allies had risked descending into darkness to help him rescue Alara. Marion unrolled one of the maps, her hands trembling slightly. In Superhabib's light, they saw an old schematic of underground Lumina. "Ilara showed me these once," Marion explained softly. "There are large chambers connected by these tunnels. Some were sanctuaries or storerooms centuries ago. If they took her, maybe." She trailed a finger along the map. "Here, the Chamber of Vigilance. It's directly under the city center, near the spire's foundations. It was used as a meeting hall in ancient times according to records." She gulped. "If I were a crazy cult trying to summon or appease a shadow, an old meeting hall with symbolism might be where I'd go." Superhabib nodded. It was as good a lead as any, and his instincts tugged him in that direction too. A faint current of dread seemed to waft from that path. "Stay close," he instructed. "And if anything happens, fall back immediately. I can't risk all of you." Amir gave a curt nod, and the group advanced down the left fork toward the heart of the catacombs. The tunnel sloped downward, the carvings on the walls growing more elaborate. Superhabib's light revealed mosaics under layers of grime, scenes of people gathered in a circle, raising hands to a radiant sun, and opposite them, figures cowering from a black swirling mass. "It's just like Alara said," Superhabib murmured, recognizing the representation of fear and hope locked in battle. Amir's jaw tightened as he too absorbed the ancient warning depicted. As they neared the presumed meeting hall, they began to hear a low droning sound. It was voices, several of them chanting in unison. The words were indistinct at first, echoing off the stone, but as they drew closer, one phrase became clear. "Embrace the shadow, surrender the light." Repeated over and over. Superhabib motioned for the others to dim their lights. He cloaked his own aura somewhat, enough to proceed without giving them away immediately. They reached a large oaken door set into an archway. The door, likely untouched for generations, now stood ajar, flickering orange light spilling through the gap, along with the cadence of chant and the acrid smell of burning wax. Peering in, Superhabib's heart clenched. The chamber of vigilance was a broad circular room with a high domed ceiling. Along the walls, iron sconces held torches that cast dancing shadows across scenes of faded frescoes. In the center, atop a raised dais of stone, was Ilara. She was bound to a tall chair or throne-like structure that appeared to be part of the chamber's ancient furniture, her head lolled to one side. She looked conscious but weak, eyes half open, lips moving as if trying to speak but no sound coming out. Surrounding the dais were 6 figures in dark robes. They held candles made of black wax and stood at points of a rough circle, their backs mostly turned to the door. They were the source of the chanting. Each time their voices rose, the shadows in the room seemed to thicken, converging above them in tendrils that reached toward Ilara before receding. It looked as though they were attempting some vile ritual, perhaps to hand her over completely to the shadow or drain her hope. Superhabib's fist clenched. These were no monstrous wraiths. These were people, corrupted by the shadow's lies. Hurting them was a last resort, but he had to stop this. He whispered to Amir, "Get ready. I'll break their circle. You all get Ilara once I draw their attention." Amir nodded, signaling the young officer who steadied himself and Marion, who gripped a heavy flashlight like a club. Taking a deep breath, Superhabib stepped into the chamber, letting his aura blaze forth. "This ends now," he shouted, his voice echoing like thunder under the dome. The chanting halted as the robed figures spun around, momentarily blinded by the sudden light. One let out a hiss. His hood slipped, revealing a gaunt face with wide, feverish eyes. Superhabib recognized him as the man Amir had described in the precinct, one of the deluded who had spoken about worshipping the shadow. "You," the cultist rasped, "interloper, the master warned you would come." Without hesitation, Superhabib strode forward. The cult leader, the gaunt man, snatched a ritual dagger from inside his robe and pointed it at their captive. "Stay back! The ancient ways will prevail again. Fear will swallow this city, as it should. Hope is the lie that weakens us," he cried out, voice cracking. "Hope is what makes us human," Superhabib shot back. He raised a hand and a ribbon of light cracked like a whip, snuffing out the candles in 3 cultists' hands. The chamber dimmed and the shadows above churned uncertainly. "Look at yourselves," he implored, trying reason even now. "You're not serving some liberation. The shadow will consume you too. Stop this before it's too late." For a fraction of a second, a couple of the figures wavered, their stances faltering, but the leader snarled, "Hold fast! We do this for deliverance from false light." He began to chant a guttural phrase, and the remaining lit candles flared with an unnatural black flame. Tendrils of darkness shot down from the ceiling, encircling the cultists as if shielding them. Detective Amir took that moment to act. He and the young officer burst into the room behind Superhabib, weapons drawn. "Drop the knife," Amir commanded. The officer rushed to the dais, trying to cut Ilara's bonds with a pocket knife. The leader shrieked in rage and hurled his dagger at the intruders. Superhabib intercepted, plucking it mid-air before it could strike Amir. But that was the opening the other cultists needed. With crazed fervor, 2 of them lunged at Superhabib, swinging jagged pieces of broken stone like clubs. Another flung a handful of some powder into the air, which erupted into a cloud of stinging smoke. Superhabib staggered as the acrid smoke hit his lungs and eyes. The cultists swarmed him, striking at his glowing form with desperate fury. Their blows glanced off his energy aura, but they were tenacious, clawing and screaming. He held back from unleashing a full force wave that might seriously harm or even kill these misguided people. Instead, he swept a low arc with his leg, tripping 2 and sending them sprawling. Amir wrestled one to the ground who had charged at Marion. The old archivist assistant surprisingly clobbered another cultist with her flashlight as he tried to rush past her toward the door. Meanwhile, the cult leader screamed an incantation, and the darkness in the room coalesced behind him, forming a towering shadowy silhouette, a crude mimicry of the shadow's avatar. It loomed and swung a smoky limb down toward the dais, where the officer was sawing frantically at Ilara's ropes. "Look out!" Superhabib yelled. He dashed forward and caught the shadowy limb with both hands. The impact drove him to one knee, the weight of it immense and cold. Gritting his teeth, he channeled light into his arms. Slowly, he forced the shadow appendage upward, pushing the entity back toward the cult leader. The leader's eyes widened in disbelief as his conjured guardian was overpowered. Superhabib then let loose a concentrated burst, a spear of light that pierced the shadowy guardian and struck the leader's chest, knocking him off his feet. The shadow form dissipated into oily wisps that faded into the corners. With the cultists either down or dazed, Amir and Marion hurried to Ilara's side, helping the young officer finally cut the ropes. Ilara slumped forward, barely conscious. "Ilara," Marion whispered, cradling the older woman's head. Ilara's eyes fluttered. She was alive. Superhabib exhaled in relief, only to feel a stab of pain in his side. He glanced down to see the cult leader, face contorted in fanatic rage, had crawled and retrieved his dagger, driving it into Superhabib's flank. The blade sank into the fabric of the suit, but hit something akin to solid light beneath. Superhabib's enhanced physiology prevented it from going too deep. Still, it hurt. The leader tried to pull the dagger for another strike, but Superhabib caught his wrist with an iron grip. "No more," Superhabib said, voice heavy with sorrow. A bright glow emanated from his hand, and the leader cried out as the dagger heated and clattered away. The man collapsed, sobbing, the fight gone out of him at last. Silence fell in the chamber, save for the whimpering of a few cultists nursing minor burns or bruises. Amir kicked the dagger far aside and signaled the officer to start restraining the now docile group. "We'll get them topside and under guard," Amir muttered. He looked at the cult leader, who stared blankly at the frescoed wall, tears carving paths through the grime on his face. It was unclear whether he wept from pain, failure, or the shattering of his dark delusion. Superhabib moved to Ilara, gently placing a glowing hand on her forehead. She winced, but then relaxed as some warmth flowed into her. "Habib," she whispered, using his real name faintly. "I knew you would come." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Always," he said softly, emotion thick in his throat. He carefully untied the last of the ropes and lifted her from the throne-like chair. Though exhausted and drained, Ilara managed to loop her arms around his neck. "They wanted to break me," she murmured, "to break hope." "They failed," he assured her. He held her close for a moment, closing his eyes in gratitude that she was safe. Marion wiped her own eyes, and even Amir looked like he was holding back emotion as he oversaw the cuffing of the groaning cultists. As they prepared to leave, Ilara stirred and pointed weakly toward a far corner of the chamber. "Habib!" "There," she said. On the wall, partially obscured by shadow, was an ancient inscription carved in flowing script. Superhabib approached it, still carrying Ilara but letting his light illuminate the stone. The script was in an old dialect, but Ilara, even in her state, began to translate haltingly. "When the darkness rises again to claim the halls of light, the beacon shall be the battleground. Only by uniting the light of many hearts can the shadow be cast out, for the darkness cannot stand before the dawn." "The beacon ... Amir mused. "Could that mean the Lumina spire?" Superhabib nodded. "It must. The spire is a beacon built in modern times, but perhaps intentionally aligned with whatever this inscription refers to." He remembered Ilara's earlier caution about the spire and saw her give a tiny nod of confirmation. The shadow's final play would likely center there. It made sense. Turn the greatest symbol of light into an instrument of darkness. Clutching the weakened Ilara close and with allies at his side, Superhabib began leading the way out of the chamber and back through the tunnels. They emerged from the catacombs with Ilara safe and the cultists in custody, but the war was not yet over. Above ground, the night was beginning to wane, but an uneasy stillness hung in the air, as if the city itself awaited the next move. The heroes had rescued their guiding light and uncovered a crucial clue to the Shadow's endgame. Now they would have to use that knowledge to prepare for the final confrontation. Dawn was approaching in more ways than one, and with it would come a decisive battle for Lumina's soul. Chapter 8, Shattered Light. Back above ground, Superhabib and his allies lost no time in strategizing. The inscription's warning was clear. The final battle would center on the city's beacon, undoubtedly the Lumina Spire. Dawn was approaching, but the night's darkness still clung to the skyline, as if the shadow itself lingered in the clouds. In a conference room turned ad hoc command center at City Hall, a handful of key figures gathered. Superhabib, Ilara, resting on a couch, pale but insistent on being present. Detective Amir with a bandage on his forehead from the tunnel scuffle, Marion with her ancient maps, and Dr. Serena Holt, the city's leading expert on energy systems and one of the Spire's chief engineers. Dr. Holt had been roused from her sleep by urgent calls when the citywide blackout hit. Now, her curly hair still disheveled, she leaned over blueprints of the Lumina Spire's internal wiring and crystal matrices. The Spire was designed to gather solar energy and amplify it for the city's use, she explained, pointing at a schematic. It's essentially a giant prism and battery. In theory, we could invert it, make it project rather than collect, a controlled release of all that stored light energy, perhaps augmented by other sources. She glanced at Superhabib and Ilara. They both knew she meant the hope energy Superhabib could channel. If the shadow comes to the Spire as we expect, Serena continued, we could use the Spire to hit it with a citywide blast of light, like turning our greatest light into a weapon. Her voice was steady, but there was worry in her eyes. This was uncharted territory, tampering with the city's central power source and symbol. Ilara from her seat added softly, remember it said the light of many hearts united. Technology alone won't suffice. We need the people. Just as they sang last night, we might need them focused together again when the moment comes. Superhabib agreed. We'll have them ready. But first, we need to weaken it, contain it at the Spire. They concocted a plan. Use the Spire's output to create a trap. The idea was to lure the shadow in by activating the Spire's beacon at an unusual time and intensity. It would see a surge of light and be drawn out to fight, thinking it could corrupt the Spire or snuff it. Once it engaged, the Spire's systems, modified by Dr. Holt, would form a cage of energy around the shadow, holding it long enough for Superhabib and the United Citizens to deliver a decisive blast of hope-fueled light. Time was short. The sky was beginning to lighten to a deep blue. Dawn was near, and they suspected the shadow might attempt something at sunrise or soon after, trying to preempt the return of daylight. They moved quickly to the base of the Lumina Spire. The tower soared over 1,000 feet high, a marvel of modern engineering with a core of light-collecting crystal and a lattice of projectors around its crown. The plaza around it was empty now, eerily silent after last night's crowds, except for a few security personnel and police officers on watch. Inside the Spire's control room beneath ground level, the team set to work. Dr. Serena Holt and her technicians connected cables and recoded software to change the Spire's functions. Superhabib stood by, offering to channel some of his own energy into the system to prime it, though Serena warned that might be dangerous. Ilara, though weak, insisted on climbing to the observation deck partway up the tower. She said she wanted to be present to speak hope over the city when the moment came. Amir assigned an officer to escort her safely there. As the last adjustments were being made, an unsettling quiet enveloped the city. The thick clouds still had not broken, holding dawn at bay. It was as if Lumina was trapped in pre-dawn gloom. Superhabib felt the hair on his arms rise. The air was charged, heavy. It's close, he murmured to Serena in the control room. She nodded, sweat beading on her temple. Almost done. There. She hit a sequence on the console. Overhead, the hum of the Spire awakening resonated through the structure. On exterior speakers, a calm voice began advising any citizens in the vicinity to keep distance. An official cover story had gone out that the Spire was undergoing emergency system tests to explain the unusual activity that was about to happen. Spire is in projection mode, Serena said. On a monitor, power levels climbed. The central crystal was charging, drawing from reserves and the first rays of sun above the cloud cover. Superhabib stood ready at the main breaker, a large handle that when pulled would unleash the collected energy upwards. Suddenly all monitors flashed and went dead. The hum of machinery halted. Lights flickered off. Serena's expression fell. No, 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 it shut down the system, she typed furiously, but the keyboards were unresponsive. In the dim emergency lighting, they realized what happened. The Shadow had anticipated their plan and struck first. Perhaps through some lingering tendril in the electrical grid or an inside agent, it had triggered a Spire shutdown. Superhabib cursed under his breath. If the Spire's systems were offline, their trap wouldn't spring. Manual override? He asked. Serena nodded, pointing to a ladder. At the top of this shaft is the manual release for the energy, but someone has to physically trigger it, and the containment fields won't be calibrated. She didn't finish. The implications hung. Without proper containment, releasing all that energy would be a huge blast, potentially destructive.
If it comes to it, I'll do it by hand, Superhabib said. He wasn't about to let the Shadow win due to technicalities.
As if on cue, an inhuman howl reverberated through the air outside. It started low, rising to a piercing shriek that cut into the mind. Superhabib and Serena winced. Through the control room's glass window, which peered into the plaza, they saw it, a swirling mass of darkness pouring like an inverted waterfall from the sky, descending upon the Spire's peak. The Shadow had come. Detective Amir's voice crackled on the radio. It's here! At the top, it's... Oh God! Superhabib shot Serena a glance. Go, I'll try to get systems back, she urged. Without hesitation, Superhabib flew up the shaft, smashing open the hatch that led out near the apex of the Spire's central column. The scene atop the Spire was chaos. Tendrils of living darkness coiled around the metal girders and antennae. Security lights that should have illuminated the Spire head were shattered. Amidst flickers of sparking wires, he saw Officer Nguyen, the one who had escorted Ilara, lying motionless, perhaps struck by flying debris. Ilara herself was pressed against a railing on the observation deck below the peak, clutching onto a beam as fierce winds whipped around, winds driven by the Shadow's vortex-like presence. Amir was a few meters away, pulling himself up from where he had been thrown against the wall, blood on his scalp. Above them loomed a sight out of nightmares, the Shadow in its near-complete form. It had amassed into a towering cyclone of blackness, studded with half-formed faces that grimaced and dissolved. From it emanated that paralyzing aura of dread. Superhabib didn't hesitate. He barreled into the dark cyclone, blazing with light. At once he was engulfed in freezing black fog. Whispering voices assaulted him from all sides. Failure, frail, hopeless, they taunted. He felt tendrils clawing at his mind, dredging up every doubt and fear. He saw a vision of himself faltering, Ilara falling from the tower, the city burning. Gritting his teeth, he roared and expelled a pulse of light. The vortex recoiled just enough that he burst out the other side, panting. Ilara's voice rose from below, shaky but audible. Remember the light, Habib. We're with you. She had one arm raised despite clinging for life, as if reaching out to him. He felt a surge of resolve. He was not alone, far from it. The Shadow then did something unexpected. The swirling mass suddenly funneled downwards along the Spire itself, disappearing from the open air. A heartbeat later, Superhabib realized where it had gone. Inside, within the Spire's core, was the great crystal reservoir of light energy. If the Shadow seized it, it could corrupt or absorb the very store of luminous collected light. The accumulation of the city's solar optimism, literally years of daylight saved up. It was making its bid to snuff out the light at the source. Serena, can you hear me? Superhabib shouted into his comm, descending rapidly back towards the control room. Static was his only answer. He dived into an access hatch mid-level and found himself in the central chamber of the Spire, a cavernous cylindrical space housing the main crystal. The sight stopped him cold. The crystal, normally a radiant pillar of multicolored light, was now darkening. Tendrils of black crawled across its facets like ink in water. Inside, flickers of the shadow's form twisted, pressing against the translucent walls as if trying to merge with the light energy or devour it. Dr. Serena was in this chamber, having climbed a maintenance stair. She stood near the base of the crystal, frantically flipping breakers and hitting the manual release control, a large lever on the floor, trying to trigger the energy dump. But nothing happened. The shadow's presence was somehow holding it in. Serena looked up as Superhabib landed beside her. "It's inside the crystal!" she shouted over a rising hiss. The crystal was beginning to vibrate violently, cracks spiderwebbing along its length. If it corrupts this, it could send out a blast of pure despair, she realized with horror. In that moment, they both knew a detonation was coming. Either the shadow would break the crystal, releasing all stored energy in a destructive wave, or worse, turn it into a bomb of darkness. "Get everyone clear," Superhabib said firmly. "But," Serena began. "Go," he urged. "I'll release it manually. I might be able to contain the blast." He didn't add that if this went wrong, containing it might mean sacrificing himself. Serena hesitated, then gave a quick nod, eyes glistening. She turned and ran towards the exit hatch to get clear. Superhabib floated up to the midpoint of the giant crystal, now oscillating and warping from the shadow's internal pressure. He pressed both hands to its surface. Instantly searing pain shot through his arms as darkness pulsed into him from within the crystal. He channeled light back, trying to counteract it. Inside his head, the shadow's voice screamed in rage and pain. "You think you can contain me? Foolish spark! This light will shatter and so will you." It snarled. "Not today!" Superhabib growled in return. With supreme effort, he focused on the lever below. Extending a beam from his energy, he pulled it. For a second, nothing happened. Then a deep thrum started as emergency mechanisms engaged. The crystal began to release its stored power, but with the shadow entwined, the energy came out tainted. A torrent of alternating blinding radiance and black shadow erupted upward through the spire's top, shooting into the sky like a volcanic blast of light and dark intertwined. Superhabib was at the epicenter, holding onto the crystal for dear life, pouring every positive thought he could muster into it, to try to purify the torrent even as it ripped at him. The world became a strobe of white and black flashes. He thought of Ilara's smile, of the singing in the plaza, of the child he saved at the bus, of Amir and Serena and all who fought beside him. Each memory he hurled against the shadow's onslaught. Finally, with a deafening crack, the great crystal shattered. Superhabib was flung backward like a rag doll, slamming into the chamber wall. All went silent and dark. He wasn't sure how long he was out, likely seconds, but when he opened his eyes, he saw the crystal in pieces glittering all around the chamber, slowly settling. An eerie glow of leftover energy danced in the shards, and in the center hovered a writhing mass of darkness, smaller than before but still present. It had not been destroyed by the release, rather it was hurt and unstable. Wispy tendrils tried to pull toward vents and openings, seeking escape. Superhabib tried to move and groaned. His right side felt bruised or worse, but he forced himself up. The shadow mass, sensing him, coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape with a face that was a mask of absolute hate. It lunged at him, passing through his body with a cold that pierced his soul. He gasped, dropping to one knee. The thing darted out of the chamber, fleeing upward. He heard the screech as it emerged back onto the spire's top. Staggering, Superhabib followed. On the observation deck, he found Serena alive, helping Amir to steady Ilara. The officer was conscious again too, albeit woozy. They looked at him with alarm. "It's weakened," he panted. "But it's heading out." He looked to the horizon. The clouds overhead were finally breaking apart, the first rays of true dawn peeking through. And there, a smear of shadow slipping away from the spire, moving across the sky toward the city center, desperate to scatter and regroup. "It's trying to flee!" Serena exclaimed. Without the stored energy of the spire, the shadow likely sought to hide and lick its wounds until it could strike again.
"We can't let it," Ilara said, voice hoarse but firm. She clasped Superhabib's hand as he steadied himself. "Habib, the city, it's waking up. We have one chance. Rally them like before."
He looked down at the streets far below. People were emerging from buildings, confused by the spectacle of light and darkness that had erupted from the spire. They had seen the beam, felt the shockwave of its breaking. They would be fearful again, unless he acted fast. Summoning every last ounce of strength, Superhabib rose into the air above the spire, hovering high where all below could see him as the morning light spread. He amplified his voice with a technique born of both his powers and the city's acoustic systems, making it boom across districts. "People of Lumina, this is our moment. The shadow is on the run. Don't give it a place to hide. Stand together. Show it your courage. Now." His call reverberated through the half-light of dawn. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, from the plaza, one voice cried out in answer and spread, a cheer, a rallying cry. On every street, people raised whatever they had that could shine. Phones, flashlights, mirrors catching the sunlight, breaking through. They remembered the previous night's victory and found their strength again. A wave of noise rose, shouts of defiance, car horns blaring in triumph, church bells ringing. The shadow, racing as a streak of darkness above the rooftops, recoiled at the sudden clamor and illumination from below. It turned toward the east, perhaps thinking to escape the city boundaries, but there, peeking over the horizon, was the sun itself, rising at last. Its golden light spilled over luminous skyscrapers like a benediction. Superhabib, seeing the shadow's root cut off by daylight and its essence flickering under assault from hope and dawn, knew the endgame was now or never. Chapter 9, The Heart of Darkness. Superhabib streaked after the shadow's wounded form, a comet of gold trailing a swirl of black. They collided above the city's central plaza with an impact that rattled windows below. Entwined, hero and entity tumbled through the air, a sphere of shifting light and darkness. The shadow's essence, though weakened and desperate, clung to Superhabib like tar, trying to smother his glow. Together they crashed down onto the rooftop of a low building, the force cracking the concrete and sending a puff of dust into the morning air. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the darkness began to expand, spreading over the roof like an oil spill. At its center, Superhabib struggled to his hands and knees, but the shadowy ooze gripped him. Tendrils wrapped around his limbs, anchoring him. He glowed intensely, trying to burn them away, but the shadow adjusted, pulling not at his body now, but at his mind. "You cannot defeat me," hissed a disembodied voice from all directions. "You carry doubt, and doubt is my domain." Superhabib grunted as a wave of mental anguish hit him. The tendrils at his wrists pulsed, and suddenly his vision went black. When it cleared, he was no longer on the rooftop. He found himself standing in the middle of a devastated plaza. The buildings around were in ruins, fires raging. The sky above was a sickly red. He recognized Lumina, but twisted, broken. Corpses littered the streets, and among them he saw faces he knew. Detective Amir, eyes staring lifelessly. Dr. Serena, half buried under rubble. The violinist from the rally, her instrument shattered beside her. A choking sound escaped his throat. "No, this isn't real," he whispered, but it felt real. The scent of ash and death was overwhelming. "This is the future you will create," the shadow's voice rasped, echoing through the burning streets. "All your efforts end in failure. Look at your beloved city. Your hope only prolonged its agony." Superhabib staggered forward, heart pounding. Before him, atop a pile of rubble that had once been City Hall, a figure emerged, a mirror image of himself, clad in a tattered version of his suit, eyes hollow. The doppelganger's chest emblem, once a sunburst, was now a black sun. The figure sneered. "You were never enough." It spoke in Superhabib's own voice, but dripping with venom. "You couldn't save them." Visions flared around him. He saw Ilara being consumed by darkness, her hand reaching for him as she was pulled into a void. He saw children crying out for help as shadowy forms dragged them away. He saw himself alone, kneeling amid the destruction, utterly defeated. Pain, guilt, and despair crashed onto Superhabib's psyche. He dropped to his knees in the illusion, tears of frustration in his eyes. The fake Superhabib, the Shadow's cruel avatar, loomed over him. "This is the truth," it hissed. "Without me, they would eventually turn on you. Hope is a lie that keeps them blind. Embrace the inevitable darkness. It's peaceful. All will be quiet when hope is dead." A heavy numbness welled inside him. Maybe it was inevitable. He had done everything he could, and still the Shadow had almost won so many times. Would it be so bad to let go? His strength was nearly spent. The city. Could they really banish fear forever? As these poisonous thoughts slithered through his mind, the vision of ruined Lumina began to close in, dark figures encircling him, whispering, reaching out with clawed hands. The phantom Superhabib raised a shadow blade, preparing to strike the real one down for good. And then a different sound, faint but distinct, cut through the cacophony of horror. A child's voice, clear and unwavering. "Superhabib!" He looked up, eyes searching the smoke-choked red sky of the illusion. That voice, it was familiar. From the haze stepped a little girl holding a red ball, the very child he had saved from the bus days ago. Tears streaked her dirty face, but she stood bravely between him and the shadow copy. "Please," she said, "don't give up." Behind her, forms appeared, translucent, glowing. An elderly man with a cane touching his repaired porch light. The young man from the rooftop, alive and smiling faintly. The nurse, the street artist, the violinist, Detective Amir, Ilara, figures of light stepping into the ruined scene, positioning themselves around Superhabib protectively. They were like ghosts of hope, each one an echo of someone whose life he had touched, saved, or inspired. They held candles hand in hand, forming a ring of gentle light around him. "This is your mind fighting back," snarled the Shadow, and the dark specters lunged at the ring, but each time the figures of light repelled them, flaring bright. The little girl reached out and touched Superhabib's hand. He felt warmth, real comforting warmth. The haze of despair began to lift from his heart. He rose to his feet, the numbness replaced by shame for having doubted. These were not phantoms. They were his memories, his truth. A truth the Shadow could never erase. That even in darkness people had stood with him and he with them. They were counting on him, and more, they believed in him. Superhabib faced the twisted doppelganger that the Shadow wielded. "You're wrong," he said quietly, strength returning to his voice. "Hope is not a lie. It's the promise of a better future. And as long as I live, it's one promise I intend to keep." The shadow copy shrieked and swung the blade down. Superhabib caught it in his bare hand. The weapon of darkness sizzled against his palm, but did not cut. His hand glowed with golden light, melting the shadow blade into vapors. The doppelganger staggered back, suddenly afraid. All around, the nightmare illusion trembled. The burning buildings flickered, the corpses faded. The shadow's hold on his mind was breaking. Superhabib advanced on the false version of himself. "This ends now," he growled. He placed a shining hand on its chest. The black sun emblem began to crack. The figure screamed, dissolving into ragged darkness. With a final explosion, the entire hellish vision shattered like a mirror struck by a hammer. Back on the real rooftop, the swirling darkness restraining Superhabib convulsed. To an outside observer, only a few seconds had passed since the two combatants fell from the sky. Now golden light erupted from the pool of shadows. Superhabib stood tall, illuminated from within. As the shadow recoiled in a cloud-like mass around him, he had cast off the psychic attack, and in doing so wounded the shadow at its core. Below, in the plaza and streets, citizens watched in tense silence. They had seen their hero crash down entangled with the darkness, and feared the worst. But when a beam of morning sunlight broke through and revealed Superhabib still standing, an overwhelming cheer erupted. Their collective hope soared at the sight, fueling Superhabib further. He felt it flooding into him now, the belief of thousands, lifting his spirit high. It was time to finish the fight.
Chapter 10. The Beacon of Hope.
The shadow, wounded and enraged, was not finished yet. The amorphous mass of darkness that had recoiled from Superhabib gathered itself one last time. With a furious roar that echoed through every street, it shot upward from the rooftop, expanding into a great billow of black that began to blot out the sky above the city center. It was attempting to eclipse the sun itself, casting Lumina back into shadow even as morning broke. The sudden darkness caused a hush of dread to fall over the watching crowds below as daylight dimmed once more. Superhabib launched into the air in pursuit. He would not allow the dawn to be stolen. Hovering high above the tallest buildings, he faced the boiling cloud of darkness. Tendrils lashed out at him, but this time they failed to grip. His aura flared bright, repelling them like a rock in a surging tide. He closed his eyes briefly, reaching out with his heart to the city he loved. He could feel them, thousands of souls below, each a point of light in the gloom, all turned toward him in hope. The bond between Superhabib and Lumina's people, tested and strained, was now stronger than ever. Drawing a deep breath, Superhabib spread his arms wide, as if to embrace the entire city. He opened himself to the collective spirit of Lumina. Every glimmer of courage, every flicker of faith, every shred of hope being held in the hearts of the citizens, he drew it in. From the frightened but resolute faces in the plaza, from families huddled on balconies, from first responders tending to the injured yet pausing to look upward with belief, tiny streams of light rose, converging on him. To the onlookers, it appeared as if golden fireflies were lifting from the city toward their champion. Those sparks joined Superhabib's glow, infusing him with a dazzling radiance. He became a beacon, literally embodying their hope. The shadow sensed the shift and struck desperately. It dived upon him as a colossal, screaming wraith, intending to swallow him whole in darkness. For a moment, Superhabib disappeared into the massive black shroud. The city gasped as their hero was engulfed, but the fear was short-lived. An intense brilliance ignited from within the shadow's shape. Superhabib's voice rang out, clear and strong, "Lumina, now!" On cue, the people of Lumina roared as one. From the plaza where Alara and Detective Amir leaned on each other, leading a cheer, to the distant neighborhoods where onlookers pumped fists into the air, a wave of human sound and spirit rolled across the city. It was an uproar of triumph, of defiance, an anthem of hope given voice. Empowered by their unity, Superhabib thrust his arms forward. All the light he had gathered, sunlight, starlight, and soul light, surged out in a single focused wave. It was not just an energy blast. It was the distilled essence of Lumina's courage and love, channeled through his very being. A colossal beam of golden luminescence pierced the heart of the shadowy eclipse overhead. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The shadow cloud did not merely scatter, it disintegrated. The wave of light bored through the shadow's form, and from the point of impact cracks of brightness spiderwebbed outward across the darkness. With a keening wail and agonized cry comprising countless fading whispers, the shadow began to unravel. Great chunks of the dark mass fell away and evaporated before they could touch the ground. Tendrils and shapes that had loomed menacingly now burst like overinflated balloons, popping into nothingness. The golden beam expanded into a dome of shimmering light that washed over the city. People down below felt a gentle warmth on their skin as it passed, a soothing sensation, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from the very air. Within that dome, every lingering remnant of the shadow was illuminated and erased. In alleyways and basements, frightened folk saw lurking silhouettes dissolve into harmless vapor. The last of the shadowy tendrils that had snaked through the streets flitted away like embers on the wind. Above, the entity at the center of the darkness shrank and contorted, screaming in frustration and fear. Superhabib hovered before it, unwavering, pouring on the power with steadfast resolve. "This is for Lumina," he said quietly, and then with a final thunderous push of light, he rent the shadow apart. The shriek ceased abruptly as the darkness split into two halves, which themselves splintered and dissolved until nothing remained but sparks of faint black that quickly winked out in the bright morning air. The shadow was gone, truly and completely, not banished to return another day, but destroyed by the one force it could never withstand, the united hope of an entire city. For a heartbeat, Superhabib remained aloft, shining like a second sun against the now blue sky. Then, feeling the tremendous energy finally ebb, he slowly drifted down. His feet touched the plaza ground where it all began. The morning light was pouring in unobstructed now, painting every face in attendance with a golden hue. A stunned silence hung, as if everyone were making sure the nightmare had truly ended. It was Ilara who began the applause. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she raised her hands and clapped. That broke the spell. In an instant, jubilation swept the plaza. Cheers erupted, dozens, then hundreds, then an entire city shouting in triumph. Strangers hugged and danced. Church bells pealed in distant districts. Car horns honked in celebration. Somewhere, music began to play, a triumphant melody echoing down the streets that once had known only screams. Superhabib, exhausted yet filled with indescribable joy, was swarmed by those closest. Detective Amir was there, offering a vigorous handshake that turned into a grateful one-armed hug. Dr. Serena arrived, face smudged with soot from the spire's blast, giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up and a laugh of pure relief. Marion from the archives and other citizens crowded around, everyone wanting to touch their hero, to assure themselves he was real and this victory was real. Then Ilara was before him. Superhabib gently took the elderly woman's hands in his. She was gazing at him with pride and love as one might upon a grandchild. "You did it," she whispered, voice trembling. He shook his head humbly. "We did it, together." He gestured to the roaring crowds. The city had saved itself as much as he had saved it. This, he knew, was the lasting truth of their triumph. Ilara nodded, closing her eyes as if offering a prayer of thanks. When she opened them again, she said, "The darkness is gone. The light prevails." Superhabib found there were no words in that moment. Instead, he raised their joined hands high, and a renewed wave of cheers cascaded around them. Above, the sun fully emerged from the last wisps of night cloud, shining down on Lumina, bright and unhindered. Chapter 11. The Dawn of a New Lumina. In the hours that followed, Lumina truly lived up to its name. The sun climbed higher, flooding the city with warm light as if nature itself joined in the celebration. Everywhere, people emerged from their homes and shelters, blinking in the brightness not just of morning, but of a renewed hope. The nightmare had passed. The shadow was gone, and in its wake it left a city forever changed, stronger and more united than ever before. As the day unfolded, scenes of compassion and resilience played out across Lumina. Neighbors who had never spoken before were now embracing like old friends in the streets. Volunteers organized spontaneously to check on the elderly and vulnerable, ensuring everyone had water, food, and comfort after the harrowing nights. Community leaders set up tables in the plazas with hot tea and coffee, free for all, a small symbol that normalcy and hospitality had returned. Remarkably, some of those who had vanished in the earlier days began to reappear. With the shadow's destruction, its captive victims, people who had been consumed by despair, were found disoriented but alive, wandering out of alleyways and cellars where they'd been trapped in hallucinations. Tearful reunions abounded. The renowned architect, looking dazed but smiling, was discovered at his studio doorstep and swept into his spouse's embrace. The beloved musician, whose last conscious memory was being alone on stage, now found herself surrounded by her bandmates in a group hug, promising that her next concert would be one for the ages. At the hospital, patients were returned to their rooms once power was fully restored, and doctors marveled at how some critical cases had stabilized during the city's collective push of hope, as if even the ailing had been lifted by the positive energy. News crews, now broadcasting stories of heroism instead of horror, interviewed citizens who had stood up to fear,
Children who sang to comfort their parents during the worst moments, neighbors who formed watch groups at night to keep streets lit and safe, police and firefighters who kept doing their duty despite the overwhelming odds. These tales of everyday bravery spread, inspiring even more goodwill. The cult of shadow, as some called the small group that had embraced the darkness, dissolved in the light of day. Those who had been misled were now remorseful, shaken from the trance of fear that the shadow had cast on them. Many sought forgiveness and offered to make amends by helping repair damage in the city. Their hateful graffiti was quickly painted over by murals of hope, often with those same individuals helping to paint symbols of unity and rebirth. In the afternoon, a grand assembly took place in front of City Hall, where just days ago fear had reigned. Now thousands gathered in joyous solidarity. Superhabib stood on the steps alongside the mayor and city council, who proclaimed it a day of remembrance and celebration. Lumina's flag was raised high, its emblem of a rising sun shining brilliantly. The mayor, voice booming over loudspeakers, commended the people for their courage and specifically honored Superhabib. In our darkest hour, he reminded us of our own light, she said, bringing the crowd to a standing ovation and chants of the hero's name. Superhabib spoke briefly, humble as ever. He thanked the community leaders, the first responders, and ordinary citizens who chose compassion over fear. This victory belongs to all of us, he declared. Evil thought it could divide and conquer us, but it only succeeded in bringing us closer. Lumina's true strength lies in each of you, in our unity. His words drew thunderous applause and more than a few tears of pride from the crowd. As evening approached, the city that once cowered behind locked doors was now eager to revel under the open sky. Spontaneous street festivals broke out in various districts. Children laughed and chased each other with carefree abandon, their parents watching with relieved smiles. Musicians, including the once missing violinist, gathered in parks to fill the air with lively tunes. Cafes and restaurants offered free treats. Proprietors knew that a communal meal was as healing as any medicine. Everywhere there was chatter and laughter, the sound of a city rediscovering life. Alara found herself at the center of one such gathering in a park pavilion, recounting to rapt listeners the ancient legend of how Lumina's founders had defeated the darkness centuries ago and drawing parallels to the present victory. Her eyes twinkled as children sat around her feet, listening wide-eyed to the story of how their own city had just lived a modern legend they would tell their grandchildren one day. Detective Amir and his officers walked the streets not out of necessity, but to join in the celebration, receiving pats on the back and homemade sweets pressed into their hands by grateful citizens. They had weathered an ordeal unlike any other and emerged not as enforcers of order, but as heroes in their own right, bridging the gap between authority and community. There were moments of somber reflection, too. In a quiet corner of Memorial Square, a candlelight vigil was held for those few lives lost during the crisis. A couple of innocent civilians caught in early incidents, an officer who succumbed to injuries sustained protecting others, and even the souls who had been consumed by fear and never returned. Superhabib attended, standing silently with head bowed, the gentle glow of candles reflecting in his eyes. Lumina would not forget the cost of what had been endured, nor the lessons learned. In the faces lit by candlelight, one could see resolve, that such darkness would never be allowed to gain a foothold in their hearts again. Night fell gently on the city, but Lumina glowed brighter than ever. The Lumina spire, repaired and reactivated, cast a beam of light high into the clear night sky, a beacon to let the world know that this city had triumphed over its darkest foe. Fireworks arranged on short notice by jubilant citizens burst in brilliant colors above, each explosion met with cheers. On every block the streets glimmered with lights from open windows and lanterns set on stoops, a spontaneous declaration that darkness had no hiding place here. Superhabib moved through the celebrations, not soaring above but walking among the people, sharing hugs, accepting countless handshakes and thank yous, posing for pictures with laughing teenagers, even sneaking a morsel or two from the feasts offered.
to much delight and clapping. Though physically tired, he felt invigorated by the joy around him. This was what he fought for, not accolades, but the sight of people living without fear, open and free. In a moment of quiet amid the revelry, Superhabib and Alara found themselves gazing at the city from a hill overlooking downtown. The skyline twinkled with light, and faint music and laughter drifted on the breeze. Alara rested a gentle hand on his arm. "This is a new dawn for Lumina," she said softly. "They will not soon forget what was needed to preserve the light." Superhabib nodded. "Nor will I." He knew that in the days to come there would be much work to do, rebuilding damaged buildings, aiding those who still had healing to do inside. But tonight was a celebration of all that was good and all that had been saved. The city of Lumina had faced the shadow and come out shining. They had confronted not only an otherworldly foe, but their own inner fears, and they had triumphed over both. Hope, courage, and unity had won the day. And as the hero and the historian looked out at the vibrant tapestry of their city, they felt nothing but pride for Lumina and its people. Chapter 12, Keeper of the Light. Later that week, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Superhabib found himself once again perched atop the highest skyscraper in Lumina. It was the very spot where, days ago, he had stood burdened by doubt and loneliness. Now a gentle evening breeze stirred his cape, and below him the city glowed with a tranquil energy. The streets were alive with normalcy, cars honking in mild rush-hour frustration, people strolling and laughing on their way home, the flicker of televisions through apartment windows, the distant strains of a street performer's melody. It was a symphony of ordinary life that Superhabib had never found more beautiful. He reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Lumina's scars from the Shadow siege were healing. Physically, broken glass was swept up, walls were repaired, and power fully restored. Emotionally, the city spirit was renewed. In office lobbies and cafe bulletin boards, flyers could be seen for new community support groups, emergency preparedness workshops, and neighborhood watch teams, initiatives blossoming from the shared experience, ensuring that if intangible threats ever arose again, the city would face them together. Hope was no longer just an abstract ideal. It was a practice woven consciously into daily life. Superhabib had continued his watch over the city, but with a deeper understanding now. He knew that darkness, be it crime, despair, or something more supernatural, would always lurk at the edges of the world. It could take many forms, some easier to spot than others, but he also knew that Lumina, armed with its newfound resilience and the unwavering power of its people's collective hope, was ready to confront whatever came. Where once he might have felt it solely his duty to safeguard the city, now he saw himself as part of a larger whole, a guardian, yes, but one among many lights keeping the darkness at bay. High above, with dusk creeping in, Superhabib watched the long shadows stretching across rooftops. They no longer filled him with unease. A shadow was simply a reminder of light waiting to re-emerge. He had learned that his role was not just to fight battles, but to inspire and nurture the light within others, to stand as a symbol so that even in moments of uncertainty, people would remember to find courage and kindness in each other. Down below, a billboard-sized screen in the shopping district began playing footage from the celebrations, intercut with a live feed of the serene evening streets. A news chyron dubbed it Lumina's Week of Hope. Superhabib smiled faintly. He didn't need the recognition, but he was glad the media chose that framing, focusing on hope, not fear. A familiar voice sounded in his earpiece, Detective Amir, on his regular check-in. "All quiet tonight. Might actually head home early for once. How's the view up top?" Superhabib pressed 2 fingers to the comm and replied with warmth, "The view is wonderful, Amir. Enjoy your evening. You've earned it." He heard the detective chuckle and sign off. The city's protectors, both official and unofficial, could breathe a little easier tonight. As the first stars appeared in the indigo sky, Superhabib took one last sweep of the cityscape. Here and there he spotted things that made his heart swell. A pair of children chasing each other with glow sticks on a rooftop, relishing the dark as a playground rather than fearing it. A rooftop garden where neighbors gathered for a small dinner party under string lights, the luminous spire shining steadily, its beam once again a comforting lighthouse for all to see. These were the sights of a city not just surviving, but truly living.
Superhabib stepped off the ledge and floated gently upward. Hovering above Lumina, he allowed himself a moment of pride in the people, in Ilara and Amir and all his allies, and yes, in himself for rising to the greatest challenge of his life. Peace had returned to Lumina, but it was a peace forged in understanding and solidarity. It was not the fragile calm before a storm, but the resilient serenity that comes after one, when everyone sees more clearly what truly matters. With a final look at the glowing tapestry of his city, Superhabib soared off into the night on a leisurely patrol. He was not searching for trouble this time. He simply enjoyed the feeling of the cool air and the sight of Lumina safe and radiant below. Vigilance was not a burden to him, but a promise he gladly kept for the future of this city he cherished. As he disappeared into the darkness between the stars and the streetlights, Lumina shone on, a city of light undefeated, its guardian watching faithfully over it, ever hopeful and ever ready for whatever dawn would bring.